Let me start with a quote from Plato. The penalty good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be governed by evil men. Sit with that for a moment. Today, we're not just talking about food. We're talking about what happens when people stop paying attention to the systems that quietly shape their lives. Today's subject is pigs. Nearly everyone is familiar with pigs and the pop culture icons of Miss Piggy from the Muppets, Piglet from Winnie the Pooh, Wilbur from Charlotte's Web, the folklore story of the Three Little Pigs, or today's wildly popular Peppa Pig or Peter Porker. Um, Reality is much more grim, unfortunately, for these animals. There's a practice in industrial farming where piglets have their tails cut off just days after they're born. No anesthesia. Why? This is because in factory farms, pigs are packed so tightly together that they start biting each other's tails. It's a preventative measure. Um, Here's the part that people don't address, however. That behavior is not natural. Um, Piglets are supposed to stay with their mothers for around 12 to 14 weeks. But in industrial systems, we force them to separate after just 2 to 5 weeks. Um, that early separation causes stress, anxiety, and unfortunately leads to a constant urge to suckle. So when you pack thousands of highly intelligent animals into tight spaces, that stress turns into aggression. And instead of fixing the environment, the industry cuts off their tails when they're days after being born. We created this problem and then we solved it by modifying the victim. This might sound strangely familiar to some of you. There's actually an old school RuneScape quest, my favorite game, called A Porcine of Interest. And while that quest plays it off in a more light-hearted way, the reality is this is a porcine issue of real interest. What we're looking at here isn't just about pigs, it's about systems. In these conditions, in industrial farming slaughterhouses and feedlots, pigs often develop something called learned helplessness. They stop resisting, they stop reacting, they eventually give up. Sounds familiar to humans who disconnect from reality and society, which is happening on an unprecedented scale with millions of people experiencing this. Um, but this leads to injuries. And when they happen, as they often do, treating these animals isn't considered efficient economically. So instead, they're clubbed to death on the spot due to the infection of having your tail nibbled at by the pig behind you. Imagine your job for 8 hours a day is standing in that environment, same repetitive motion, same confined space, same lack of control. Would you feel empowered? Or would something in you start to shut down, start to turn off, and start to disconnect? It's not just the animals. Many workers in these industries are people with very limited economic mobility. They're often migrants, they're often living in rural areas with few alternatives, they're getting low wages, they're getting demanding, sometimes traumatic labor that they're performing daily. They have very little ability to leave. What we've created here is a system where animals are trapped, workers are trapped, and the system doesn't need to change. To understand why this happens, we have to zoom out. Starting in the 1980s, the US economy went through a wave of financial deregulation. This led to something that we all live with today called financialization. The primary goal of corporations has shifted toward maximizing shareholder profit in the forms of institutional investors such as BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, which manage our 401ks, our retirement accounts, and they passively invest in companies. But when profit becomes the only metric that matters, everything else becomes negotiable. Animal welfare, worker conditions, environmental impact, long-term sustainability, even efficiency replaces morality, is what happens. Shortcuts are taken for ingredients, high fructose corn syrup. There's countless examples of these corners being cut, and it has led to 40% of Americans having a diet-related disease today. But the costs don't stop there. The environmental cost is ridiculous. Industrial agriculture consumes enormous amounts of water. In fact, it consumes 50 trillion gallons annually, enough to fill 75 million Olympic swimming pools, or to provide water to each person in the United States for 4,000 years. It relies heavily, industrial agriculture relies heavily on monocropping, corn and soy. It kills the biodiversity and causes devastating effects to the environment. Most of these monocrops are not grown to feed people directly even, but to sustain the system itself. There are greenhouse gas emissions at every step of this operation. Planting, fertilizing, harvesting, transporting. And the chemicals run off into ecosystems. They don't just disappear. They accumulate, they spread, they damage biodiversity locally and far downstream. But when you walk into a grocery store, you don't see any of that. You just see the price. And hopefully, it's one you like. And that's as far as we think of. But that price, it's misleading because cheap food often depends on underpaid labor. In fact, some of the largest employers in food and retail have workers who rely on government assistance just to get by. Walmart and McDonald's are a couple examples. This means the system keeps wages low, and taxpayers quietly fill the gap with SNAP benefits. Not to mention, SNAP benefits are most commonly spent at Walmart, allowing them to double dip in the system.
It's worth mentioning just how much money Walmart makes in a fiscal year from SNAP benefits. They make about $25 billion a year in net sales from SNAP alone. And that's a huge amount of money to be making from underpaying your workers and capitalizing on tax dollars. And people argue, they can work somewhere else, things like that, but somebody has to work at Walmart for you to go there and purchase things. So um, that is kind of a fallacy and doesn't really work, if you ask me. People also argue that, those jobs, McDonald's and that, are made for high school kids, teenagers, what have you, but these businesses are open outside of normal hours that you would expect teenagers to work. They're open all the time when kids are in school and things like that. So that also doesn't really line up. That's a complete fallacy as well.
So we end up subsidizing the very system we think is saving us money. Cheap isn't cheap, ever. It's just hidden cost. So what do we do about it? Unfortunately, there's no single perfect answer, but there are choices. We can start by being more intentional about where our food comes from. Support local producers when and where possible. Choose quality over convenience when we're able to. Just as importantly, use your voice in our democracy. Voting for policies and leaders that prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term profit. Find them. Now, to be clear, not everyone has the financial flexibility to make these choices easily. That's part of the problem and the system. But awareness is where change begins, because once you see the system, you can't unsee it. So let's hone it back into Plato. The penalty good men pay for indifference
To public affairs is to be ruled by evil men. And if we look around today, there is no shortage of rampant evil leadership in the United States.
Indifference is what allows these systems to continue. But awareness, that's where change starts. Thank you. If you found this valuable, check out the resources linked below, including a deeper article on my blog where I break this down further and share ways to take action. Thank you for watching, and let's make the invisible visible.